let's go back a little further and start this story and just really show people how the heck did we get here? Because you're so good at telling the story. You tell it in such detail in your book. Let's take it back to like the 1900s. I mean, there really was no heart disease before 1950s, right? I've heard you talk about this. It was really Eisenhower's heart attack that sort of sparked this revolution.
Yeah. Well, many of your listeners will have heard this story, so I will maybe keep it relatively brief. But the early 1900s there was almost no heart disease, and people will often say, well, they just didn't know how to diagnose it. But in fact, it had been diagnosed and written of in detail, including in medical textbooks by the mid 19th century. It was very, very rare, but it was understood. But the hospitals just were not seeing cases. There are famous medical accounts of this in the 20s and 30s where there's just a tiny handful of people coming in with heart disease. During the 1920s, the late 1920s, there was they started to see at the end of the 1920s like a really quite rapid increase in the number of heart disease cases. That was in part due to the ability to diagnose it through in a different way of diagnosing it. So there's some tricky bits with the statistics, but really by the 1940s and 50s, you have heart disease has risen to be the #1 killer, and I think it's one of these things one has to really try to imagine, like all of a sudden people like you and me or me, I guess at my age, a little younger, but men are dropping dead in the prime of life. And everybody's fathers had lived to ripe old ages unless they had gone to war. And so this was brand new, that young men were just dying in the prime of life. And there were a number of theories about this rising public health emergency, a number of ideas. Like some people thought it was vitamin deficiency, quite a logical hypothesis. Other people thought it was auto exhaust with the rising number of cars that were then coming onto the road. Other people thought it was a type A personality. You run around and scream at everybody, and then all of a sudden you drop dead of a heart attack, and you probably deserve it for being so mean. And then there was this idea by Ansel Keys, who was a physiologist at the University of Minnesota. He had a number of other degrees as well. And he was really focused on this idea that it was cholesterol. And it was cholesterol and saturated fat. It was the diet heart hypothesis. And that hypothesis held that eating dietary cholesterol in eggs, shellfish, liver, and saturated fat, which was in those foods and also in dairy, they would turn those hard fats would clog your arteries and then fill up your arteries and give you a heart attack. It was quite a visually powerful image, right? It's like putting, hot oil down a cold stovepipe. You're like, ooh, and then you die of a heart attack.
It makes sense, right?
Except it totally makes intuitive sense. It's just that, that's not the way biology works. But no. That was the idea that it wasn't the idea caught fire so much. It was that Ansel Keys, as I try to portray in my book, was this very domineering individual. He was extremely sure of his own ideas. He was willing to bully anybody into an argument, and he just had an unshakable faith in his beliefs. And so he got himself appointed onto the Nutrition Committee of the American Heart Association. At the time, was really the only group speaking out about heart disease. And in 1960, whereas the American Heart Association was saying, we wish we knew it would cause heart disease, but we really don't think there's any evidence. By 1961, Ansel Keys gets himself onto this small committee, and he convinces all of them to state that it is saturated fat and cholesterol, his hypothesis, that is the cause of heart disease. And this is really the first statement anywhere in the world. 1961, also the same date as that Time magazine cover that you brought up so nicely. That was the first advice anywhere in the world, to limit your intake of meat and dairy in order to avoid, and to switch to having polyunsaturated vegetable oils in order to avoid a heart attack. That's where it really all began. And it's really a fascinating story because I think it has parallels with the moment that we're in today, because we are now in a similar moment of public health emergency. Just total emergency and this tremendous urge and desire for answers. And so we are often just jumping the gun with the science, right? Like maybe this treatment, maybe this will work, maybe that one, maybe it's, we don't, and they're publishing journal articles without peer review and jumping way ahead of the gun. And it is precisely that situation that was happening in 1960. And so we can understand why they would jump to conclusions and grab onto a hypothesis without proof. And I forgot to mention that the most important kind of focusing event of all this was in 1955 when President Eisenhower himself had a heart attack and was out of the Oval Office for 10 whole days. That would be like 10 days without Trump at the hospital. And everybody's thinking, this is truly, it's a way of, nothing would focus public attention more than having your president be in the hospital with a potentially killer disease. So really it was Ansel Keys who stepped into that vacuum of the lack of knowledge with his idea and won out. And that has been, he's easily the most influential nutrition scientist of the last three generations. And his ideas have persisted. And in the very short capsule answer of why they have persisted, despite being tested and not being found to be true, is that what grew up around his ideas was this huge food pharmaceutical establishment and a bureaucratic establishment that embraced and endorsed him. And the media endorsed him. And so, it's become impossible to back out of this hypothesis because there has been she's just rigidified into this giant establishment that cannot give up. They cannot give up their profits. They cannot give up their professional investments. They cannot say they're wrong.